Good evening. My name is Xenia McCoskey, and I am a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that lived with these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, and the Departments of Educational Studies, Sociology, American Studies, Africana Studies, and the Center for Spirituality and Social Justice, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? A panel discussion exploring CRT, centrality, and the current culture wars. If I asked all of us to take a few moments and write down a list of words that currently describe American society, I'm willing to bet that a word that many of us would mention is divided. The next question might then become, what are we divided over? Again, I am sure that we could further break down division to create another list. Perhaps some of us would mention words such as race, racism, and social inequalities. In newspaper headlines over the past few weeks, there have been recent stories of book bannings within school districts and crowds of angry parents and community members showing up at school board meetings. These parents are accusing school districts of poisoning young minds with inappropriate materials on race and racism, including books on famous Black political figures such as Michelle Obama, and novels by award-winning Black authors like Toni Morrison. These events are all part of a fierce current national debate over how history and current events should be taught in schools, with critical race theory being the latest target. Partly fueled by the Black Lives Matter movement, the New York Times 1619 Project, and national conversations regarding race, many school districts are re-examining curriculum and structural racism in their systems to teach more nuanced views of US history and contemporary culture. When I heard about this panel in a staff meeting a few weeks ago, I was taken aback, not because of the topic, but because one of my former high school teachers is a panelist tonight. Mr. Wagner was my teacher for my last 2 years of high school, and I remember sitting in his room and frequently reading the dozens of quotes pasted all over his classroom walls. One of those quotes was posted on the podium, and I read it every day. It said, "If a person knows what happens, they have average ability. If they know how it happens, they have superior ability. And if they know why it happens, they have exceptional ability." This quote has become ingrained in my memory, and it is especially appropriate for tonight's panel, as our three panelists are here to answer and explain the what, how, and why that so many of us have been asking over the past several months in regard to critical race theory. Why has critical race theory entered public discourse and become so controversial? What is its place in US society and school systems? What does this controversy tell us about US society right now? And where does this conversation lead us in trying to create a more just and equal country? Here to help answer these questions are tonight's panelists. Scott Hancock is an associate professor of history and Africana studies at Gettysburg College. His interest in understanding and telling the stories of traditionally forgotten and marginalized people in history has led him to focusing on the African American experiences from the mid-1600s to the Civil War. His research has also examined the fight of Black Bostonians in the 19th century, the Underground Railroad, and most recently, exploring how whiteness and white supremacy were utilized during the Civil War. Prior to his research efforts, Professor Hancock also worked with teenagers in crisis. Katie Oliviero is an associate professor of women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Dickinson College. Before coming to Dickinson, she worked with youth and taught English literature as well as sexual education. Her current research is diverse and covers topics on critical race theory, immigration, law and social movements, QLGBT studies, and transnational feminism. Her recent book, Vulnerability Politics, examines the risks posed to historically marginalized communities, such as women, children, people of color, QLGBT individuals, all by conservative movements. Kevin Wagner is the Social Studies Program Chair for the Carlisle Area School District and has been teaching within the district for the last 25 years. As an advocate for social studies instruction, he serves on the Pennsylvania Council for Social Studies, the Middle States Council for Social Studies, and the Pennsylvania Teachers Advisory Board. He has won numerous awards for his teaching, including but not limited to the National Liberties Museum's Teacher as Hero Award, the Natural Veterans of Foreign Wars Teacher of the Year Award, and Pennsylvania's 2014 Gilder Lehrman History Teacher of the Year. As a former student, I can also attest to Mr. Wagner's passion for teaching, especially history classes, where he is eager to engage with students on the difficult truths of US history. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. I would also like to add at this time that State Representative Barbara Glein was also invited to tonight's panel event, but declined to participate. And the Clark Forum will be hosting another similar event on critical race theory next month from an alternative perspective. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion, expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speakers, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and electronic devices. In the event of an emergency, please know that handicap accessible exits are located on the west side of the building. And now, please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Good evening. So I'm not going to silence my phone because I'm going to put a timer on in a second so I can hear it when it goes off, make sure I don't go over. So I was here, last time I was here about 19 years ago, and Clark Center invited me to come talk about the Underground Railroad. At the time, I didn't do research on the Underground Railroad, and I told them I didn't, and I thought, I know what they're thinking. There's a black guy at Gettysburg College who does African-American history. He must do the Underground Railroad. And I kept saying no, and they said, we'll give you $200, so I came. And that eventually led to an article and scholarship, and so thank you, Clark Center, for having me back. Okay, so critical race theory. So I'm going to talk a bit about what it is, but I'm going to approach that first by thinking about what it isn't. And giving you some brief outlines and terminology. Let me start my timer. Okay, whoops, that's wrong. Okay, so what it isn't, oops, I skipped one, my bad. And this is from, as it says, the Heritage Foundation model legislation, which many of the states that have bills pending or passed have drawn from the Heritage Foundation's model legislation. So these are the three primary points, and you notice the word inherently. I'll mention that and address that in a minute, why that's highlighted. My bad, going the wrong way here. So this is their second main point. So this is the legislation, this is what they are articulating critical race theory is, so what they're against. But I and other scholars would argue that actually they've mischaracterized critical race theory, because I don't know of any critical race theorists, and there are many, so I haven't read all of them. I have a book on the table there. It has 72 authors in it. That's just one volume of critical race theory. There are hundreds. So maybe you can find one somewhere or a couple who say this, but I don't know of any critical race theorist who says that people are inherently responsible or inherently superior or inferior. So the use of that word inherent is very intentional, I think, on the part of people who are mounting a campaign against critical race theory. And I would argue it mischaracterizes or misunderstands, intentionally or unintentionally, probably both, what critical race theory is. So Christopher Rufo, who you may have heard of, he works for Manhattan Institute. He's been one of the people who started, not the only one, the anti-CRT campaign back in the fall of 2020, and it was absolutely connected to the presidential campaign, and it's continued it. So this past October, 32 days before the Virginia gubernatorial election, he sent out this tweet. And when I saw this, I thought, okay, so because we want to be critical thinkers, right? I think, okay, well, does he have a point here? Are there actually departments of education that are teaching critical race theory? Because what a lot of people have said in response to the anti-CRT legislation is nobody's teaching CRT in public schools. But he seemed to have evidence that suggests that perhaps there are instances of that. So I wanted to follow his sources. And when we do that, which, so those of you who are students here, I think, man, this is just follow the sources. Follow people's sources. Does it legitimate what they say? Sometimes it does. Often you may find otherwise. And Christopher Rufo is he's a smart guy. I think critics who responded to him sometimes perhaps demonize him, and maybe that's fair, maybe it's not. But if we follow his sources, so this is part from that tweet. That's my first hint that I thought maybe something's off here. It does say it's from the Commonwealth Virginia Department of Education. And some of the other things he highlighted in his tweet, sorry, I'm not used to this touchpad here, so go a little sensitive, is that it re-engineers attitudes and beliefs. But then what Christopher Rufo didn't include, or what he didn't tweet, is the actual memo that led to that seminar. So those previous slides are from a seminar, and some of the highlights of that memo you can read here. So the key here is this was a 2-day seminar for students after school who are having disciplinary problems. It wasn't part of the curriculum of what was being taught in the schools. You could arguably say, well, but they're still learning this, although it was as it says here, 1 of 4 sessions on the second day. It was actually a small part, and it wasn't even the whole session that was involved. So does Christopher Rufo have a point? You can draw your own conclusions from that, but the way that it was communicated on Twitter by Rufo and others is that the Virginia Department of Education is teaching critical race theory in the schools. And I would argue, I think that's a mischaracterization of what was going on in Virginia. But then he sent another tweet this next day, or the same day actually, and it looks more damning because this is from a memo from the Virginia Department of Education, and it includes this one line that they're drawing from critical race theory, and don't have time to go in the whole context of the memo. So that's one part of this memo here, right, that he's circled, this is image from his tweet. But if we look at what he didn't circle, this section at the top, one of the people that Rufo has criticized, I was listening to a podcast where he was being interviewed for about an hour, and one of the people he's criticized at length is Ibram Kendi, and books like Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist. And so he's criticized him at length and criticized him as a representative of critical race theory. Well, this same memo actually includes this section here, where Kendi, if you've read any of his work, he defines a racist idea as any idea that suggests one racial group is inferior or superior to any other racial group in any way, which would suggest that the way the Heritage Foundation, and including Rufo and others, have defined critical race theory, that it teaches that people are inherently racist. Well, this is a critical race theorist saying it's saying the opposite of that. Right? So again, follow the sources. Just follow the sources that sometimes people themselves use. One of the things that I'm struck by is when I follow the sources of many of these kinds of organizations or figures who are significantly critical, whether it's critical race theory, the 1619 Project, and I'm not suggesting that none of their criticisms have any validity, because critical race theorists criticize each other all the time, right? So It's not that there's no validity to any of them, that we shouldn't engage, but most of the time when I follow their sources either lead back to one another, or it's a case like this, where they are misusing their source. Frankly, if this was a paper that a student gave me in a first-year seminar, I would say you're misusing the source. This isn't good scholarship. You're misunderstanding or mischaracterizing the source. And it's be a critical thinker when we look at these things. And the impact, though, of that kind of misleading information, so that helped the governor, Youngkin, win in Virginia. It was the only thing that got him to win, but it certainly helped because it was 2 days before the election. And Christopher Rufo, one of the things that he does, and many other people, and I'm not just picking on him, but I think he does what is typical, is he will use anecdotal examples like this. I don't have time to check all of his anecdotal examples. But one of the things he said recently in a podcast was he's got 1,000 stories of people who have gone to like trainings at a corporation where they're being besieged by critical race theory, or public school students. And then, well, okay, even if he had 1,000 instances of public school students, there's over 50 million public school students in the United States. So if he's got 1,000, I would want to know, are all of them accurate? If some of them are accurate, does that constitute critical race theory being taught in the public schools in a way that is shaping the next generation? And then we can have a debate, well, should it be or should it not be? But of course, the critics would argue that it should not be. But as we see, it is having a real world impact. So what is critical race theory? So here's some basic ways in which I've kind of boiled it down based on some of the reading. I wouldn't call myself a critical race theorist, but I've definitely used it in some of my work, some of my research and writing. I think it's helpful, it's informative in many ways. So these would be some, it's a framework of analysis for understanding these sorts of things, particularly for people of African descent. And how and why practices and policies, Kendi's big on policies. There's CRT people. I work with one of my colleagues in Africana Studies at Gettysburg. She's definitely a critical race theorist, and she is very critical of Kendi because she argues that he focuses too much or too exclusively on policy. So there are these debates, but I think in large part, CRT scholars would agree that it's thinking about how race has shaped and influenced and created and maintained systems of advantage and disadvantage, particularly based on race in the past and present. And by the way, 1619 Project, CRT, not the same thing. I think a lot of the problem is CRT has been conflated by its critics as history. History and CRT are not the same. There's a lot of overlap, but they're not the same thing. So what does CRT do? As I said, I would argue it's an excellent analytical tool. It helps us think more precisely about outcomes and impacts. It helps us understand how we can make connection between individual experiences and larger patterns. So anecdotes are important, but they're not the whole story. The larger patterns are important, but they're not the whole story. So we look to explain cause and effect. And it's not just about deconstruction. It's also about how do we actually figure out how to improve life opportunities for people of African descent, for people of other categories, particularly subordinate categories. And this is why it matters. Because as Baldwin said, history still shapes us. It's present in all that we do. And Ty Sejuli, he was at a Gettysburg Winter Park lecture series a few weeks ago and said this as part of a conversation. I thought that's an excellent way to challenge those who are arguing that critical race theory can make, or teaching histories like the 1619 Project, which again is not without flaw, that it makes people uncomfortable. And so Julie's he's an old white guy, 36 years in the U.S. Army. So he's not exactly fit the mold of some kind of radical liberal, and he's not afraid of that kind of history. Great speaker too, by the way. So I'll just conclude early, so we can be brave. So the title of this was Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory, right? Or what's to be afraid of critical race theory? And so the opposite, I think, is, well, we don't need to be afraid, right? We can be brave. And so those of you, if you don't know what Sankofa is, it's a term from the Akan people in what's present-day Ghana, and it's this notion that we draw from the past, we look back to the past, the ancestors, in order to move forward effectively into the present and the future. And that actually, if you don't understand how you got to where you are, if you don't know the structures and systems and your personal histories, all that stuff, if you don't understand that and have a good grasp of that, if you can't explain how you got to where you are, why should we listen to you? And critical race theory, I would argue, helps you understand that so that we can listen to you, so that you have useful solutions for the present and future challenges that face everybody, regardless of what their sexuality, race, ethnicity, class is. And I'll just conclude there and pass it off to Katie. All right. And you don't need this, right? I don't need that. Okay.
No, I don't want to share. I want a slideshow. All right, good. All right. So who is afraid of critical race theory? That title for this panel is an allusion to Edward Albee's 1962 play, Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf? So that play is not about Virginia Woolf, the famous feminist writer, but Virginia Woolf is herself venerated for how she explored the emotional lives of her characters, how she peeled back the layers of upper-class life and women's lives in particular, and that's been invaluable for over a century of scholars in helping us think about economic inequality, gender inequality, and racial inequality. So Albee reportedly explained that the title of his play, Who is Afraid of Virginia Woolf, means who is afraid of the big bad wolf of living without false illusions. So if we extend the layers of that illusion to this CRT panel, who's afraid of the big bad wolf of CRT, I think part of the charge of this panel is to peel back the layers of why CRT invites concern. Why does it create fear and resistance? For whom does it create resistance? And what do these emotional fears and resistances tell us about racial and identity-based power dynamics? What does it tell us about national values? So I wrote a book on that, and so my remarks today are looking at CRT legislation to help us understand what the stakes are. And I really appreciate Professor Hancock's description of CRT. One of the things I'd like to add, especially as a white scholar who uses critical race theory as part of my larger theoretical lenses, is that I think it's important to attribute it. So there's a host of people, 72, I think you said, Professor Hancock, in that anthology. And some of the original people that we often talk about are African-American legal scholars. So Derek Bell, Devin Carbato, and the esteemed Kimberly Crenshaw. And one of the things I'd like to add to that description of CRT is that it's attentive to the way that multiple systems of inequality work together. So that's what Kimberly Crenshaw terms systems intersectionality, the way that sexisms, racisms, economic insecurity, nativisms, and homophobia oftentimes work in tandem with each other, historically in the present, and the way they carve out shifting but also durable systems of disadvantage and advantage as well. So CRT is emphasizing how institutions, how laws, policies, our educational system, our mass incarceration system work together with social factors like stereotypes. And that could be for women of color, that can be unstated stereotypes and expectations that cleave to all different kinds of privileges. And so individuals navigate institutions, we live in social arrangements, so intersectionality and critical race theory is tracking out the interplay between the institutional and the social and how they shape our actions, and how they shape oftentimes our individual actions, our implicit biases, our sense of identities. And so CRT is really emphasizing the interplay of the institutional, the social, and the individual when it advocates for modes of change. So as Professor Hancock noted, the representation and interpretation of what critical race theory is in the public arena very much deviates from the very rich, nuanced methodology that critical race theorists outline. So I think it's important for a second to look in a little bit more detail about what some of this legislation is saying critical race theory is, right, and what that means. So trackpad, that was just in case I need it. Professor Hancock also, this is just a bill talking about the bans in, there have been bans passed on CRT in at least 16 states and introduced in 13 others. I want to focus, I think, on Florida's as well. So the bills share a lot of commonality and almost exact language. This is in part, I think, due to the Heritage Foundation's model legislation. So if we can focus on one and then generalize out. So last June, Florida's Department of Education issued guidance requiring that teaching must be factual and not distort historical events, and I don't think we dispute that that is a good practice. And it provided some examples of what those distortions look like. So it paired denial or minimalization of the Holocaust, and again, no responsible educator would dispute that we should avoid minimizing the Holocaust. But it paired teaching the truth about the Holocaust with prohibiting teaching critical race theory. And it defines critical race theory as the following. So it defines it as the theory that racism is not merely the product of prejudice, but that racism is embedded in American society and its legal systems in order to uphold the supremacy of white persons. And if you'll see at the bottom as well, educators may not define American history as something other than the creation of a new nation based largely on universal principles stated in the Declaration of Independence. So there are a couple troubling implications of this framing in the first place. So one of the things I think it's important to note is that, of course, minimizing the Holocaust fuels white supremacy, right? So the Holocaust anti-Semitism was explicitly couched in what we would now call white supremacist and ableist logics. So what's so ironic about these guidelines is it limits our ability to teach about how white supremacy operates in the United States, in our past as well as in our present. And this distorts American history in so many different levels. So the US government may have been founded on largely universal principles, as this guidance notes, but exercising these rights was explicitly denied to all women, so half the population. They weren't extended to anyone who was not deemed white, free, or enslaved, and white men needed to own property to exercise many of these rights. So the American dream and its ideals of democracy always had a big asterisk next to it, footnoting a list of groups who weren't included. So any responsible teaching of history and critical race theory flags the distinction between these universal principles and their expressions. It points to the asterisks. And I think that in my experience teaching high school, at the high school and college levels, students of all kinds of identities are really energized by exploring that particular irony. I do think it has a lot to do with being a teenager and living in many ways feeling like you're an adult, but you don't have the agency that adults have, right? So that discrepancy is really deeply felt. So restricting how we teach about these histories not only limits our ability to discuss and how racism and white supremacy operates in the past, it actually deliberately avoids teaching our students about the way that US ideologies operate in the present and how they're complicit in so many of the world's atrocities of the recent past. So for instance, if we look at the US's early 20th century eugenics policies that were trying to promote heightened birth rates amongst Americans of Northern European descent, and this is part of what created our modern ideas of whiteness, those eugenic policies helped inspire the Third Reich's own anti-Semitic policies. So you can read Florida's Department of Education guidance as actually fueling the kind of distorted education that it claims to prevent. All right, so let's peel this back a little bit more. What is the problem with teaching the historical truth that racism and exclusion were embedded in the US's founding governance structures and that they persist today in many ways? So let's look a little bit more at what is defined as critical race theory. And again, we'll keep our eye on Florida, but this is shared across a lot of different states. So this is a bill that's passed the Florida Senate and the Florida House. It bans the teaching of critical race theory in public schools. It also prohibits employers from requiring trainings on dimensions of critical race theory and institutional sexism. We're going to focus on the teaching implications here. So the bill requires that instructional methods and materials should support the principle that individuals are equal before the law and reinforce the principles of individual freedom. So that's at the top. So it has a couple different points, and I will read the ones that are bolded. So it says that these materials shall not teach that an individual is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously, solely by virtue of his or her race or sex. As Professor Hancock highlighted, right, that is not what critical race theory is focusing on, but it's being represented that way. It says that these materials shall teach that no race is inherently superior to another race. I think, again, Professor Hancock's talk spoke to that quite well. That no individual should be discriminated against solely on the basis of their identity. It also argues that meritocracy or traits such as hard work are not racist, but are fundamental to the right to pursue happiness and to be rewarded. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, does not bear responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex, and that an individual should not be made to feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or another form of psychological distress on account of his or her race. All right, so let's unpack that. What I find so interesting, and so many commentators have found notable, is that this legislation is focused on teaching about systemic race, on how teaching about systemic racism makes some people feel, right? So C point F, about not feeling discomfort or anxiety. And it then is very concerned about what these feelings might imply about an individual's racial or gender identity. So C point A, that no individual should be viewed as inherently racist merely due to their identity. And one of the distortions that these bills do is that they're focused primarily they argue that critical race theory and teaching about systemic racism is primarily about changing individual feelings and our perceptions of identity. And claiming that in doing that is creating a discriminatory pedagogy of guilt, of anguish, of discomfort. So I think it's really important to remind us here that critical race theory explicitly challenges the idea that racism is solely about individual prejudice or bias, right? That's one of the main corrections that it's trying to do. It challenges the idea that racism is safely in the past. It's focusing on systems, the laws, the policies, the institutions that perpetuate racial inequalities in both the past and the present, right? And it's thinking about how those systems are shaped by unstated social values and how that shapes individuals' behavior. And so what these critiques do is frame critical race theory as solely focused on the institutional drivers. And that, I think, is a really big distortion. I also think it's always worth mentioning that stretching your mind is part of learning, right? I oftentimes frame learning as a kind of stretch where we don't want to rip our muscles, but learning creates greater flexibility, intellectual nimbleness, and a kind of strength, right? It sparks curiosity. And so in that same way, teaching about systemic or sexism or racism should stretch us a little bit, right? And it should be uncomfortable for a lot of ways. It shapes all of our lives. These are very violent histories, and those violent histories shouldn't settle well. And these violent histories have harmful presence, and that, again, shouldn't be something that settles very well. And these are also uncomfortable histories because they challenge the idea of meritocracy, right? And so this is, again, a bit of a misrepresentation of what critiques of meritocracy are trying to do. The critique of meritocracy is not that our hard work should not matter, right? But it argues that hard work alone will not dictate what we achieve and how we are recognized, right? So it argues that, so critical race theory is reminding us that this playing field is not even, right? So it's pointing to systemic forms of racial and gender exclusion, bias, and reduced opportunities that create obstacles on that playing field. It's pointing to what we call the sticky floors of racial bias and the glass ceilings of gender bias. It reminds us that birth circumstances aren't merely luck of the draw for wealth and income in particular, and that uneven access to those resources do shape achievement. It recognizes that there are invisible escalators of advantage that speed some of us along, often without us knowing it, and that there are also invisible buffers that protect us that we might not see. So this is what feminist scholar Peggy McIntosh referred to decades ago as the invisible knapsack of white privilege. So talking about this knapsack can be really uncomfortable for educators and students alike. CRT, alongside feminisms, asks us to look at what that knapsack contains. It asks us to look at who created it, who it benefits, and the effects when we think that we all have the same more or less the same knapsack. Critical race theory points out the obvious: we don't. It asks that education in particular doesn't fall for the conceit of difference blindness and color blindness. And I'll start to wrap up with an example of this. So again, we are in Florida. Not that. We'll use this one. All right, so the Florida House just passed another law yesterday prohibiting classroom discussion around sexual orientation and gender identity in elementary schools. And so it justifies this by arguing that parents should have control over their children's education. And this is a great case study in how difference blindness doesn't work. So the law seems neutral and difference blind. It's arguing that we shouldn't teach about gender and sexual orientation, gay or straight, for 5 to 8-year-olds. What it forgets, of course, is that our curriculum already invisibly teaches about heterosexuality and dichotomous gender roles every time, all the time. So every time a book references a mom or a dad while discussing another topic, like dragons, that's teaching about heterosexuality without consciously intending to. The ban's not banning teaching, mentioning tandem references to mom or dad, and it shouldn't. But a bill like this does make teachers more reluctant to include in their curriculum a book that, when discussing that same dragon, mentions that that child has 2 moms. And I will say that's one of my kids' favorite books. So difference-blind policies seem apolitical. It's a great book. It's about a dragon who doesn't want to breathe fire, right, because that's really mean, and this dragon just doesn't want to be mean anymore, right? It's called A Different Kind of Dragon. I highly recommend it. All right. So difference-blind policies, they seem apolitical. They seem like they're not setting up norms around heterosexuality, gender roles, or race. But in that apolitical neutrality, they're doing exactly that, right? And so much of curriculums that are focused on racial justice, right, are asking us to include more diverse kinds of representations, to create more windows and mirrors in our curriculum. CRT provides a very lucid explanation for why we only provide a couple mirrors, right? And at its worst, this legislation is implying that adding more mirrors for our students of color, for our girls, for our queer and our trans kids is illicit because it makes some students, particularly white students and boy students, look through more windows as well. And I think asking our kids to look through many, many more windows, as well as having many more mirrors around them, is exactly what education is supposed to do. So this legislation is striving to have the opposite effect, right? It's trying to chill teachers' capacity to teach more capaciously. And I think Mr. Hancock will help end us on that. And so I think one of the things to consider is that what we are afraid of in critical race theory, right, is that by banning critical race theory, you make it more difficult to bring equality principles closer, right? You make it more difficult to start erasing that asterisk. Thank you.
Okay, I'm a history teacher, so I'm going low tech, no technology. And it also involves, as some of my students will know, audience participation. So get ready. So I framed my part of the talk in terms of questions. So I'm going to ask you this. How would you assess the following pieces of information in terms of United States history? True or false? 1, the U.S. Constitution prohibited Congress from abolishing U.S. participation in the international slave trade for 2 decades. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision legalized racial segregation. The overwhelming majority of slaveholders in the United States were white. Slavery was abolished 3 decades later in the United States than in most of the entire British Empire. Okay, I hope you got them all right and said true, because they are. And if you did, you could not be taught these facts in the state of Oklahoma if House Bill 2988, introduced in January of 2022, is now approved. And it would also allow parents to sue me as an educator if I taught those with a fine of $10,000. Or in Texas, House Bill 3979, which did become law in May 2021 and was updated in December of 2021, which prohibits teachers from teaching, quote, the advent of slavery in the territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States, end quote. So how many of you, by a show of hands, ever actually heard about critical race theory before 2019? For those of you at home, not one hand just went up. Why not? Well, that's because the 1619 Project came out in 2019. It was launched in August of 2019 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the first enslaved Africans who arrived on Virginia soil, 20 and odd captive Africans, brought by the White Lion from the Kingdom of Nagando, present-day Angola, if you need to know, making it the landing point of Point Comfort, now Fort Monroe, in the English colony of Virginia. But that's not true history either, because actually the first case of enslaved Africans is in 1565 by the Spanish at St. Augustine. So the question becomes, why 2019? All of a sudden everyone now knows about CRT. Well, maybe it's because news organizations of all types help to hype that story as well. I will not name names, but one broadcast network mentions critical race theory 1,300 times in the first month of 2020. Yeah, I actually counted them. So what's the foundations for pushing back against CRT? Much of the language and the actual pushback comes from only one source and one source only. Not good research, right, Zenny? It comes from Citizens for Renewing America, formed in 2021, whose mission is, quote, to renew an American consensus of a nation under God with unique interests worthy of defending that flow from the people, institutions, and history, end quote. They then went on to publish a toolkit called Combating Critical Race Theory in Your Community, and every single piece of legislation working its way through a legislature in any state has drawn directly from that toolkit. So what's the pushback from the legislature? Since January of 2021, 41 states have now introduced bills or taken steps that would restrict critical race theory and its teaching. 14 states now have laws, 20 states have a bill that's been proposed, 7 states have a bill that has been vetoed, and 11 states said we're not even touching the issue. One important item to note, if you're really weird like me and you want to read all of them, none of those state bills ever passed actually even uses the word critical race theory, except for some reason Idaho and North Dakota. So what about Pennsylvania? On June 7th, 2021, this came out. Introduced by Representative Russ Diamond, House Bill 1532 and co-sponsored by Carlisle's Representative Barb Gleim, titled Teaching Racial and Universal Equality. Now, if you like acronyms, that stands for TRUE. It says, no instructor, teacher, or professor at a public school district or public post-secondary institution shall teach, advocate, or encourage the adoption of a racist or sexist concept while instructing their students. If that passes, I'm out of a job. I would argue that state legislatures are focusing on the history they learned when they were youth as the correct way of doing history. But social studies curriculums have broadened to include new stories and new perspectives in US history. Students want these expanded histories. More and more students want to hear those stories about themselves and the people that actually look like them. Using both primary and secondary sources, teachers are bringing those stories into the classrooms. They're giving them the students, and they're asking them to draw their own conclusions from both historical and 21st century perspectives. That's how history works. CRT is exactly that. It's a theory. It's in its title, Critical Race Theory. It was actually organized in 1989 at its first annual workshop on critical race theory, but it's been around since the 1960s. How comes none of you ever heard of it until 2019? It recognizes that our ideas of racial difference have been socially constructed. Socially constructed. It doesn't attribute racism to white people, and it looks at how our institutions are laced with racism. If I can't teach about that, then I cannot teach Plessy versus Ferguson in 1857, that says a black person was a piece of property. I can't teach about Dred Scott in 1896 that literally created separate but equal policies. So what happens when you look at state standards, like Pennsylvania's state standards for US history? Many of them actually downplay or even leave out the history of slavery and white supremacy, anything before the Civil War. African American history doesn't even appear in many state standards outside of social, economic, and political causes for the Civil War. And in fact, in 2018, the Southern Poverty Law Center reported only 8% of high school seniors could even identify that slavery was the root cause of the Civil War. If you don't think it is, here's something I couldn't teach under the Pennsylvania legislation if it passes. The Civil War was about slavery. Its own vice president, Alexander Stephens, on March 21st, 1861, said, quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery's subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this moral truth." But I can't teach that if this Pennsylvania law passes. That's our history. That is the Vice President of the Confederate States of America. In fact, only 32% of high school students could correctly identify that the 13th Amendment ended slavery. It's not the Emancipation Proclamation, in case you want to know. So why would creating such pieces of legislation tie the hands of myself and other social studies teachers who teach this? The movement tries to divorce school history textbooks and instruction from new and more critical scholarship of America's past. Most high school textbooks make historical debate appear in the margin rather than central to the academic discipline of history. Using both primary and secondary sources are valuable teaching tools that, when they're placed in conversation with one another, enable our students to see and engage with the contested nature of historical interpretation. Implicit in legislation barring teaching racism is the misguided assumption that just because a teacher introduces a concept into his or her course, automatically obliges every single student to accept that as singular truth. As Zenny pointed out earlier, I've got quotes all over the place. I am a guide on the side, not a sage on the stage. I bring to my students all points of view so that we can have a brave space open for discussion about all issues. A history teacher's job is not to hand down truths from on high, but to raise questions and direct discussions. Once again, on my door is the sign, "Do you question answers as much as you answer questions?" Historians can and they do disagree with one another as they sift through all this evidence. History as a branch of knowledge is always searching for meaning, and it's a constant source of argument. Yeah, historians argue with each other too. And all historians are revisionists because we're constantly finding new information to add to the story. The way I learned history is not the way my students learn history today. Any examination of racism in this country's classrooms might cause students discomfort because history should be uncomfortable. There's another sign right inside my door. I teach hard history. If I can't teach America's real history, then I can't teach about Bacon's Rebellion in 1676 and 77, 100 years before the Declaration of Independence, that established the first time the word race enters the American colonist's vocabulary. Because God forbid a white man went together with a group of black people and rose up against the establishment. And in just a few short years later, all of a sudden the word white appears in every colonial document. When politicians encourage teachers to censor the historical record and thus prevent discussions of controversy, they reduce primary and secondary education to nationalistic indoctrination. Let me say that again. When politicians encourage me as a teacher to censor the historical record, they are reducing social studies to nationalistic indoctrination. Censorship yields truncated history that's so one-sided, nationalistic, and boring that it fails to prepare students for critical thinking in the real world. And if you want to know what nationalistic history education does, look at 1930s Germany. The purpose of education is to serve the common good by promoting open inquiry and advancing human knowledge. A free and open society depends on the unrestricted pursuit and dissemination of knowledge. Our students are rising voters, inheriting a very fragile democracy at a moment when their very educational lives depend upon it. Our students aren't the future. Our students are the present. And someday when they become voters, they may just remember what legislators have done. I don't want them to prostrate in awe in front of my feet I want them to sit in my seat and be a historian. Look at all the evidence and let them draw their own conclusions. I'll end by saying, take inspiration from my favorite guy, TJ, as I call him to my class, Thomas Jefferson, whose life embodied many of the tensions and contradictions that we're talking about right now. In a letter dated December 1820, he says this, quote, "This institution will be based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. For here, we are not afraid to follow truth wherever it may lead, nor to tolerate any error, so long as reason is left to combat it. And combat it as a social studies teacher, I shall." Thank you.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, please wait for a microphone to reach you before asking your question. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to the rest of the audience. We will now take the first question.
Hi. I think this is working. So I'm going to try to phrase this in a way that makes sense as I sort of, think all this through. But I think, like a lot of students, when I was in high school, I took AP US History and AP Government, these other AP courses. And of course, these tests are standardized. They're taught, the courses are taught and the tests are given in the same way to students across the country. And they include materials like Plessy v. Ferguson, the Constitution, other documents. If states begin banning these materials and their content, do you have any indication of how that may change those lessons? If in states where these materials are not wrongfully banned, will students still not be taught them in order to keep the test standardized? Is there any thought or looking into that?
Yeah, actually, ironically, just this past week, the College Board put out what AP stands for. And one of them says that they oppose censorship, and that if a district puts in place some piece of doctrine, or a state legislature does, that disallows a teacher to instruct based on what the AP curriculum for AP US History states, that the College Board will remove every designation of AP for that entire school district in every course. This has been out here since the 1950s. They just wanted every teacher to know it now still exists. So if some of these legislations go into effect, and I can't teach those, then the entire Carlisle area school district will lose every AP class that it teaches.
Howdy. I don't know why everybody giggled at that. So have you, as professors, seen most of this pushback coming from organizations and directed sort of at the organization of the schools that you work at, or schools in general? Or, like was said in one of the earlier presentations, since it is being presented in mostly news shows that are directed towards common people, have you seen it on a more personal basis by specific parents or concerned individuals against specific teachers? Is it more on the sort of greater institutional scale, or on the targeted individual scale?
Well, I can say, anecdotal information is worthwhile, but always needs to be considered as just that, anecdotal. But certainly, I have student teachers at Gettysburg College, and I know teachers who teach in the public schools in the areas around where I live who are telling me that books are being banned in Adams County school districts, that teachers are feeling tremendous pressure and fear for saying things. Frankly, what, can I call you Kevin?
Sure.
What Kevin has said, if he had said that and he was teaching in Gettysburg, he'd probably be out of a job. mean, at college level, I got tenure. What are they going to do to me? So I don't think this has affected colleges and universities, even public colleges and universities that I'm aware of.
Some of the bills are targeting colleges, though, right? So Iowa has a bill that applies to public universities. It says that it limits instruction on institutional racism, sexism, and white privilege, right? So Idaho has another bill. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, especially with tenure as well. And I mean, there are reports of teachers getting fired. The Florida Department of Education superintendent, that's the wrong word for it, but he bragged about firing a teacher that was focusing significantly on Black Lives Matter in her classroom, for instance.
And I can speak for our area here in the Carlisle Area School District. It hasn't been a big issue for us. I've heard 2 or 3 voices maybe at a school board meeting, not an angry protest. They were rather civil. Some of you there was an article that the Sentinel did, and I was a part of that a month or 2 ago. I got 4 or 5 really nasty emails from that, but that's been the extent of everything. So I think we are a very diverse school district, and we use that to our benefit, and I think that helps.
Which, by the way, we were talking beforehand, and it probably varies a lot from one school district to another, which is why you voting in your local school board election really matters.
Hi, so I kind of want to go back to the whole conversation about universities and colleges. I was wondering if a lot of these laws come into place and students' knowledge of issues relating to race and of history relating to race actually decreases as a result of this. How do you think this will impact college scholarship coming out of the schools where students are going to now with this lack of knowledge?
By scholarship, you mean like students getting scholarships or the scholarly work coming out?
Scholarly work,
okay.
Yes.
I don't know.
I think what these look like when they're implemented is going to be the question. But I mean, if you can't teach about institutional racism, or you limit how you teach about institutional racism or sexism, when you think about these schools as training teachers, right, and training historians, and training English teachers, so and a whole host. So I think that will limit their knowledge capacity. I mean, a lot of when looking at I'm drawing from some of the work that I've done on anti-democratic movements. I mean, a lot of this is intended to be hyperbolic, and it's intended to have a chilling effect, right? It's intending to, make teachers think twice before they teach that unit on race and economics, where they're talking about redlining practices, which was restricting African Americans' access to mortgages, right? And they're asking them to limit the way that teacher might consider using that unit to help their students think through about how racial inequality is operating in the present, right? So that chilling effect is pretty dramatic, and it sounds like from both of your testimonies that that's very much in place.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I just have a question in terms of the transnational impacts of critical race theory, especially, because it's not really, because the colonialism also happened in a lot of other lands and also other Western imperialism as well. And so kind of how does it impact the education and historical, knowledge of other countries, around the world, if that makes sense.
I don't know. I think that's a fabulous question, right? I mean, I think in the U.S. context, we already give ourselves an innocence narrative that says that we weren't part of colonialism, right? We might reference settler colonialism and the displacement and genocide of indigenous tribes in the U.S., but we don't talk about campaigns in the Pacific. We don't talk about Puerto Rico. I mean, that was my education, at least. I don't know how that's changed.
Yeah, we cover all of them in mine. No. We've talked about the Filipino insurrections and Puerto Rico, and yeah, it's an interesting one because one of the things we're grappling with, I know even at our high school level, is we're still very Eurocentric in the way we teach history. Even though we say it's, I hate to admit it as the program chair, it's world history, but it's not. It's still, we do a little bit with Latin America and a little South America, but there is no Asiatic history. There is very little with African, and hurrah that we talk about white man's burden, but that's about the extent. So we've been really trying to dig deep to how do we expand that, because it's not just an American thing.
I think I'm sorry, were you?
No, that's okay.
Yeah, because if I understand part of what you're asking, if I understand correctly, is has critical race theory had an international impact, right, beyond the U.S.? Is that, and I'm not an expert on that area. It has had some, but not a great deal that I know of, but maybe others of you know more. But I think part of that's because it is, so I called you Katie before.
You can call me Katie, it's okay.
As Katie said, it is a U.S.-based body of thought, a theory, as Kevin said, and it has, and there's reasons for that it's U.S. because, as Katie said, the U.S. has this innocence narrative, particularly that gets perpetuated after the Civil Rights Movement, that the Civil Rights Movement largely solved the basic problem of racism being embedded in U.S. institutions. And critical race theorists are actually criticizing the liberal people, right? They're not criticizing conservatives. Their focus, particularly coming out of the legal field, I counted 60 of the 72 scholars in this book. This is the third edition, Critical Race Theory, the cutting edge, and the first edition came out like 20 years ago. 60 of them teach in law schools. And their focus was on civil rights legislation by primarily white liberal politicians and legislatures that had fallen short. Right, and that it had missed the ways in which race had shaped American systems and institutions and economies and a host of other things. And so because it has that heavy U.S. focus, I'm not sure how much that translates in places where they haven't had a problem acknowledging that inequities are embedded in those societies. Interestingly, though, I think in one of the places, in Australia, there are some debates about similar kinds of things. And the podcast that I mentioned earlier, that Christopher Rufo I was listening to, was a podcast in the UK by the podcast host who was very sympathetic and agreed with Rufo. And his take was, this is coming to the UK, and he was trying to resist that. So my guess is where it's going to have the most impact and controversy are going to be societies that have similar kinds of innocence narratives or not seeing race, the ways in which race and racism may have shaped their institutions in really fundamental ways.
Hi, so one thing that you mentioned was that oftentimes people say this is an anti-CRT bill, and then people respond with, well, you're not really talking about CRT. And I know that Professor Oliviero talked a little bit about it being about feelings and people not wanting to be offended or feel guilty in the classroom. And I was wondering, obviously there is something that people are afraid of at the root of this. Do you think it is about people's feelings, or if not, what do you think is the root fear that is driving all of this anti-CRT legislation?
Great question.
Well, I think one beginning place is that the critical race theory challenges our understanding of what equality looks like, I think in ways that Scott is alluding to, right? So legal structures frame equality as being difference blind, right? As being colorblind, being neutral, right? So that's what equality is supposed to look like. We know we're an equal society when we don't see your race, we don't see your gender, we don't talk about your race, we don't talk about your gender. And so critical race theory, as you were pointing out, really takes white liberalism to task, because it's saying that actually forbids us from talking about the ways that these identifiers do matter, right? The way that it shapes our lives and the way that systemic forms of discrimination are operating in the name of being neutral and in the name of being colorblind. And I think that one of the values that this uncovers is that, difference blindness gives a lot of cover, right? And allows me to think that the advantages that accrue according to my white skin privilege, right, aren't advantages, right? It allows me to buy into the myth of meritocracy, and that is very uncomfortable to think about the fact that, and I think it's important to use the I here, that my achievements really aren't only about how hard I worked, right? And that does feel very threatening, and I think that's one of the dimensions where you see it there.
And I'd build on that, and I think, and this isn't just me, many other scholars are saying this, that when there was a black geographer who read years ago, said whenever there's an advancement of the rights of subaltern peoples, there's a retrenchment by the dominant group, regardless of the society or what, how that hierarchy in a society is defined. And so, so one of my critiques of critical race theory has been for a long time that there are many critical race theorists, perhaps most, who would argue that whiteness really is the organizing principle of US society. And so some of the critiques of critical race theory, when they say, well, that CRT teaches that white people are inherently racist, they're using that word inherently for a very particular purpose, because they know how that's gonna resonate with most Americans, right? They're gonna react against that. How can you say that I'm inherently racist? But people like D'Angelo do say that if you're white, you can't separate yourself entirely from being involved in a society that perpetuates racial disadvantage for certain groups and racial advantage for white people. And so that sounds like maybe she's saying inherent, although she's not saying that, right? The public discourse doesn't want nuance or complexity. So there's an analogy that I would have tried to think of analogies that ways I can explain it is I think, so I'm not in favor of pollution. Anybody here in favor of pollution? And so I'm not critiquing the Clark Center. I try not to use single-use plastic because, like the Great Garbage Patch in the Pacific Ocean, like a third or two-thirds of it's plastic. But I can't live in the United States and not contribute to the problem of pollution. There's just no way around it. Try to minimize it, try to do the best I can. So if we had a word that was the equivalent of calling somebody a racist, like you're a pollutist, and people say, how dare you say I'm a pollutist? Well, I'd have to say, yeah, that's true. So I think that's part of what D'Angelo was saying. But when many white Americans hear that, like Katie is saying, one, it implies a difference, and that maybe I have an advantage based on that difference, and we're supposed to be egalitarian, we react against that. And so I used to think, thinking that whiteness is the organizing principle and defending that and reacting whenever that's threatened, reacting against that, I think that's reductive. I don't like reductive, as historians, we don't like reductive stuff. But I think, so I turned 60 last November, and I think the older I get, the blacker I get. And so, and the older I get, the more I think it's harder and harder for me to argue against that, especially when we see this kind of retrenchment today, that this firestorm in many ways that just keeps going on. I thought when this first came up, the CRT stuff, it was going to die out. It's not dying out at all. And it seems to me that in many ways it's a response to that. Having said that, I'm sorry, I'll stop quickly. I think it's important that we try to be empathetic in our analytical thinking, not sympathetic, but empathetic, and understand that people, especially if they're struggling and they have very real fears and they want to protect their kids, and if they're hearing things like what Rufo is saying and others that lacks nuance, lacks complexity, then yeah, they're going to be afraid, right? They're going to react against that. So I get that. And we have to figure out how, and it sounds like you're doing it, how do we articulate and enter and open and welcome people into conversations that are going to help them think through this without making them defensive and just angrier and more afraid. So.
And I would add into that, I mean, that's kind of my comment about having that. I don't like to use the word safe space. I don't think there is a safe space anywhere in the world. That brave space in the classroom that we bring to it, to have those conversations, because I think the danger, if these go into play for teachers and students alike, is that you're going to put a gag on both the student and the teacher. And Congress tried that in the 1830s and 40s with a gag rule that said you couldn't use the word slavery on the floor of the Senate or the House. You know where that got us to. So we have to have both sides of the dialogue. We can't just shut one down by a piece of legislation. And that's what frustrates me, I think, the most of the arguments of the pieces of legislation that are coming out. They're trying to totally shut down one side of the argument. We have to find a way to be able to have civil discourse throughout that. That's the cornerstone, to use Alexander Stevens in a different way, the cornerstone of our democracy.
Just one more thing with that. I think one of the ways to navigate that is to focus on the institutions, right? Not to depersonalize it and to say that there isn't individual responsibility, right? But so Michael Kimmel, who's a feminist theorist who's looking at masculinity, one of the things he points to is, and when he's talking about institutional structures of sexism, right? He says, you tell a young man that he is the beneficiary of all these systems of sexism. He doesn't feel that way, right? He feels, you're telling him that he's driving the car and that he controls the car, and he feels like he's just the chauffeur for somebody else, right? When you focus on the institution and the way those systems can privilege and advantage, right, I do think that helps a little bit with the defensiveness, because it does neutralize a little bit the sense that, like, okay, I'm bad, I'm perpetuating this is my prejudice. It helps you think about those systems that advantage you or disadvantage you.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you for an excellent evening. On the last question, which kind of was looking at sort of motivation at a personal level and the way individuals are responding, I was struck by Mr. Wagner's information, which I was unaware of how much of this legislative effort on critical race theory is being driven by a private organization. And I'm wondering whether similar things are going on with are there small private organizations driving efforts to push back on teaching of evolution, LGBTQ issues, transgender issues, climate science? And is there also an agenda in the background here of undermining public education and the support for public education? We have been underinvesting, maybe disinvesting in public education for years and years and years. And I think there's been a deliberate intent to have less support of the general public for funding public education. And are these kinds of attacks on what is being taught, censoring what's going on in our public schools, is there an agenda potentially there about, is this part of trying to undermine support for public education as we become more divided and divisive about what can be taught, how can we teach, what's going to go on within our public schools?
I don't know if I have that is the great what if. I don't really have an answer. I haven't heard, there hasn't been a whole lot of pushback, it seems, nationwide in terms of LGBTQ plus yet. I think Florida is stoking the fires of that one to see where that will go. I mean, locally, our own representative is kind of against transgender people in playing sports and in high school. Is that an inroad into sow decisiveness as a part of it? I don't know. And it is having a damning effect, no matter how you look at it, whether it's CRT or other issues. I mean, over the past 2 or 3 years, You know, I was just looking at Shippensburg. You know, this year they're going to have only 7 history teachers graduated from the entire university. Wow. 1 science teacher and 0 world language teachers. And educators are leaving in droves because they're just tired. They're tired not because of the pandemic, although that has certainly helped, but for a whole host of all these other issues that just keep coming forward at us left and right. And there's a few people willing to fight the good fight, but there's a point of no return for some, and I don't know when that will happen.
That makes me think back to the earlier question about college scholarships, whoever asked that. I teach a senior seminar, 8 students, history majors, and they did ask the first week, should we reference CRT in any of our sources or anything? And I had to tell them, well, that's probably a decision you need to think about carefully if you're planning on going into teaching. So, which is, unfortunate that I have to think, well, that's a fair question for them. But.
And by the way, I should mention, when I asked the question, how many of you heard about CRT before 2019, I could raise my hand as saying I didn't hear about it either before 2019. I had no idea what that was. It just never was even on my radar. And in fact, I think the first time it was, even when 1619 Project came out, I hadn't heard about it yet. Maybe I watched the wrong newscasts, I guess. Out loud voice. But I think the first time I heard it was actually from our own director of curriculum instruction, and said, I have a parent asking about CRT, and I was like, what's CRT? Like cardiopulmonary resuscitation or something? I had never heard of it either. So it's a beast that's in the room now.
We have time for one more question.
Hi. Thank you for this talk today. I had just one question, which was, you talked about how CRT wasn't mentioned pre-2019 in the public discourse. I'm an American Studies major, so we tend to study a lot of what has been labeled as critical race theory, whether that's the 1619 Project or work by Tia Miles and other scholars who tend to focus on questions of race, class, and gender. And I was wondering if that is an accurate label used by the scholarship that has been put into the category of critical race theory, or is that a label that was created in 2019?
Well, I'd say from the perspective of the discipline of history that it's been the latter, that many historians who have been labeled critical race theorists didn't know that they were. And not that they would necessarily disagree with a lot of the premises and thinking and theory and analysis of CRT, but like even Tia Miles, who you mentioned, I'm not sure she would have said pre-2019 she's CRT. The 1619 Project is not critical race theory. There are certainly a lot of overlap, and many of them might consider themselves as CRT scholars, but yeah, that's but it's part of the genius of the strategy. I am fascinated that you're having another session with an alternate perspective. I want to come to that because, and not to heckle, but because, like I said, there are legitimate critiques of CRT. Most of what they've displayed, Kevin and Kay displayed, and most of the stuff that's out there in public is not that. One of the questions I keep asking people who are heavily critical of it is, have you actually read any CRT scholars? And I'm not asking that in a sarcastic or disrespectful way. I mean, have you read them, or are you only going on what you have heard about it? Because if you're only going on what you've heard about it, then my next question is, well, how do you know that that's accurate? How do you know that's well-founded?
This concludes tonight's presentation. Please join me in thanking our panelists.